Today on The Naturalist, we're going to continue what I've come to think of as the Legere Challenge. Mike Legere is the Executive Director of Forestry New Brunswick, and I believe it can be fairly said that it is his job to present the ecology of New Brunswick as perfectly okay, especially in light of forestry activities, in particular the massive industrial-scale clear-cutting and spraying of the forest with glyphosate that goes on all around the province. Mike Legere wrote, back in December, an editorial called "A Picture is Not Worth 1,000 Words," in which he argued that documentarians that portray the status of New Brunswick forests and ecology as poor must, and I quote, carefully curate, end quote, their footage to misrepresent the true state of the New Brunswick environment. So, carrying on with the Legere Challenge, today we are going to fly along the east side of New Brunswick from Moncton to Charlo. And once again, we're going to use the technology presented in the Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 to accomplish this. For decades, pilots have gotten their flight sim time with the Microsoft Flight Simulator. But the latest iteration of this software is something special because it uses actual satellite imagery to portray the landscape. Down at ground level, it has some limitations, but the higher we go, the more directly it draws from satellite imagery, so what you see portrayed down below is as accurate as that imagery. It also uses a technology called photogrammetry, in which it transforms that imagery into a 3D space so that the imagery can be used in the context of a flight simulator. As we get higher, you'll see that the technology is very good. It's not flawless, and we'll take a look at a few of those flaws along this route. Flying over open areas, wilderness areas. Flaws typically occur in places where satellite images taken at different seasons of the year have been interstitched, or where the photogrammetry has misinterpreted wilderness land features for something more familiar to the humans who created the software. For example, I remember once flying over a remote area in the Alaskan wilderness to look out the virtual cockpit window and see what appeared to be a single suburban city block there in the middle of the roadless wilderness. It was a place the photogrammetry had misinterpreted piles of boulders and the open paths between them for the structures of houses and roads. But apart from such unusual occurrences, the photogrammetry is going to present the world below us very accurately, just as right now it's presenting Moncton, where we're taking off, very accurately. So accurately, in fact, some of you from there may well have recognized homes and stores where you live and shop. We are going to turn a north by northwest course and fly directly to the small settlement of Charlo, 131 miles away from the airport. That route takes us directly over Miramichi, which we took off from in the first video in this series, the New Brunswick Forestry Apocalypse, Miramichi to Fredericton, and which, if you already saw it, has made you aware that the interior of New Brunswick represents an absolutely devastated landscape in terms of forestry, with clear-cuts and tree plantations as far as the eye can see, so much so that I had great difficulty identifying a single plot of healthy and mature forest outside the visual areas of cities and settlements. Normally when I do these videos, I like to use the lighter, nimbler planes, in particular the X-Cub, which is a light but capable bush plane, because of the great visibility it offers through its spacious cockpit windows. But it's a fairly slow plane with a maximum speed of just over 120 knots. Today though, we're going to use the TBM 930, a fast turboprop plane with a cruising speed of about double that. It's a long route, and this will allow us to cover the ground more quickly, while at the same time giving us ample time to study what we see in the landscape below. And to allow us a better view of the landscape, instead of flying at the usual 3,000 feet, today we're going to climb to 5,000 feet. In many ways, this is advantageous because the higher we go, the more the Microsoft Flight Simulator will rely directly upon satellite imagery and the less on interpretations using the photogrammetry technology. So, at this moment we're climbing just outside of Moncton, heading north by northwest. And looking through either side of the cockpit, what we see is intact forests, the dark green of pasture meadows, the lighter shades and flatter forms of plowed lands, and small pale dots here and there that represent homes, barns, and dwellings and businesses. But as we are moving rapidly outside of Moncton, we'll see less and less in the way of businesses. At this point, we're not even 10 miles out, and we're only just above 2,200 feet. We'll be climbing for a few minutes more yet, but we're already high enough up to begin to see the landscape below us. See there, through the port side window, those dark green meadows, appearing smooth within the forest. Those are typically pasture grounds or hay fields. The reason for the dark green appearance is that I have set the flight simulator to present the landscape as if it were June. And in order to attain the best light, I've set the time of day to just a little afternoon. And since we're flying a bit higher than I usually go for these videos at 5,000 feet, I've set the simulator to present the sky on a clear day. This will give us maximum visibility, with the exception of some haze created by the humidity which is normally in the air. Though we are only a few miles outside of Moncton, we can already see signs of clear cuts down below. One just slipped under our port side wing, and two more are now slipping past. Clear cuts will typically stand out from other bare patches in the landscape. One, they often have angular details. They might or might not be in square shapes or rectangles. They might be cut in irregular shapes following features in the land, such as riverbanks. But typically some part of them will have angular features following survey lines, such as that group of clear cuts just now slipping below the starboard side wing. And you'll always see logging roads, either new and fresh and white, bare earth reflecting the sun, or old and half overgrown or partially tree covered, connecting to those clear cuts. Up ahead, to the fore of the starboard window, you'll see what looks like a little group of farms, and then access roads running straight out into the woods. Offhand, they look like and well could be logging access roads for the forestry industry. But where you see such roads running out behind a farm, very often that's an access road that has been made by a farmer to get at woodlands for some reason or another, such as the growing of Christmas trees or harvesting of firewood. But we don't have to look hard or far to spot more signs of industrial forestry activity. In fact, the whole landscape there, just outside the port side window, lying west by northwest of the aircraft, is a vast area of clear cuts, connected by logging roads connecting more vast areas of clear cuts. Notice the striations in the earth in the clear cuts. Those represent the past created by the heavy machinery that was used to fell the trees by the tens of thousands. Such machinery weighs many, many tons and rides on giant wheels or treads, and has what you might think of as a massive pruning clipper on the front of it that simply clips the trees down, though other machines use grinders to cut the trees down, and it typically takes only a moment to cut any tree. Gone are the days when stout men and horses went into the woods and used axes and chainsaws to fell trees, and a single parcel of ground might occupy them for months. These days, vast patches of forest are felled in a matter of days using gigantic machines. There are many grave problems with this, not least of which is the pace by which the forest is felled, exceeding the pace by which nature can naturally rejuvenate forests hundreds of times over. But those gigantic, heavy machines dig deep ruts into the earth, which is in fact the striations that you saw. This destroys the underground organisms which are so crucial to forming a healthy forest and carbon capture, and compacts the earth. Right down there we see many more industrial scale clear cuts spanning off to the horizon, and we're barely 25 miles outside of Moncton. Back to our previous topic, that compacted earth is highly subject to erosion, so the topsoil loses much of its nutritive capacity, and when heavy rains come, the compacted ground is no longer very good at absorbing water. I once did an experiment where I went to a bit of old-growth forest and poured a canteen of water out over the soil. The soil absorbed the water so fast, it was almost as if I were pouring the water down a hole. Then I went to a tree plantation, which had once been a forest a decade or two before, and poured water over the soil there. The water could barely penetrate that compacted soil and simply flowed away. For this reason, areas of massive clear cuts become propagators of floods. They cannot absorb heavy rains, and any communities downhill of them may well find themselves washed over during the next big storm. Yet more and more clear cuts. The neat fields down there represent farms. The striated clearings represent clear cuts. Right down there, that's a farm. The striations to the upper right and middle of the image in the woods, those are clear cuts in the process of being made. So, when that heavy machinery compacts the soil and removes the trees, there's another problem that is created. That ground which can no longer capture and hold rainwater, and no longer has the trees overhead to shield it with a cooling canopy of leaves, becomes subject to drying. And hot, dry summer days can quickly deplete the soil of a clear-cut forest of its last vestiges of moisture, making that forest vulnerable to drought. And as it weakens, it becomes additionally vulnerable to pathogens, insects, and blights, because weakened trees cannot effectively defend themselves. Here we are coming up on another settled area, marked by clusters of pastures and meadows, the hallmarks of farms. Notice the forest just under the aircraft. See the clear cut just now slipping below the starboard wing? Let's take a good look around, get a feel for the landscape, more farms and rural dwellings off the port wing, and then we'll jump out the aircraft and look behind us. Notice the large cluster of clear cuts in the middle of what appears to be healthy forest, and the pale traces of logging access roads all through it. This is a typical pattern in forest industry behavior. Rarely do they run clear cuts that abut the settlements where people live. People don't like them. Clear cuts are ugly, scars on the landscape, and generally people don't want to look out their windows and see them. So large areas of clear cuts are typically set out of sight and out of mind. In a relatively flat landscape like this, they don't have to be put far away from people either. It only takes a narrow hedge of forest, anywhere from 20 to 50 meters, to conceal a clear cut from a casual passerby. Notice the half-bare landscape all around us, such as down there outside the port side window. Right at the center is a massive clear cut, but the half-green landscape that appears to be dotted with trees, those are older clear cuts that are beginning to regrow. It is important to understand, though, that this does not mean the forest is growing back, especially if the land has been replanted. The forestry industry likes to tell the general public that it's perfectly okay to clear cut because they replant the trees, but that's anything but true. After they have removed the trees that are native to an area, the original trees that created a healthy forest, a biodiverse forest, they replant industrial crop species. In Europe, that crop is usually eucalyptus. In the south, and just as in Canada, conifers to the north. The deciduous trees and the wide variety of coniferous trees that hallmark the natural landscape of the Acadian forest, that's gone. And given that it takes centuries for the ecology of an Acadian forest to develop, it's effectively, in the human scale, gone forever. Wherever those forests are cut, know this: neither you, nor your children, nor your children's 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 children will ever see that forest as you once knew it again. Despite whatever tales the forestry industry of New Brunswick likes to tell the general public, that forest, such as all of that you see all around the aircraft right now, when felled, is effectively gone forever. And in truth, it may never come back. So here is the satellite image of the region that we have just flown over, portraying the landscape from about 90 kilometers high. Notice Moncton in the lower right, or the southeast of the map, and we are flying a north by northwest, almost really northwest course, up this map in the direction of Charlo. On this satellite image, the really pale areas around Moncton represent urbanized areas. And as we travel into the northwest, you'll see small blocky areas along roadsides. Those will typically represent farms or suburban areas. And the further away we are from Moncton, as well as suburban communities, what are sometimes called bedroom communities, the more likely those are to represent farms. The first major watercourse that we flew over, where all the farms were, was between Sainte-Marie-de-Kent and Bouctouche, and then we flew over the watercourse flowing out of Ford's Mills. This satellite image reveals a lot of farms, as well as a considerable amount of clear cutting in the woods between the farms. And if you look over the map, in the entire region to the west of Moncton, running all the way to the north side of the map, you can see a great deal of large pale areas, representing almost always large-scale industrial clear cuts, just like those you presently see all around the aircraft. We are presently closer to Miramichi than we are to Moncton, though, and in this satellite map we continue to follow the route there. Our aircraft would be in the lower right of the map, which would approximate the southeast, and soon we'll fly directly over Moncton, right over its airport. We'll see the clear cuts all around us continue until only a few miles outside of Moncton. There, they will become fewer and more sparse, which is the common pattern as we approach urban areas. The forestry cartel does not like the general public to see and really have an awareness of their clear-cutting activities. They're ugly. Pretty much all the landscape you see outside and below the aircraft right now is clear-cut forest. Notice that even the regions that appear to have trees are pale and have angular boundaries delineating them. And sometimes, as where the mouse cursor is right now, there are striations. These often indicate the paths that have been left by heavy machinery, as we talked about earlier, or clear cuts in some stage of partial regrowth. And just below the aircraft to the right, we see low wet ground delineated by the numerous ponds, and where the cursor is, center screen, we see logging access roads subdividing the land into wooded parcels to be possibly managed and definitely cut. Down there out the port side window is another vast region of forest, and as far as you can see into the distance, it has been all divided up with logging access roads. Some regions are dark, some regions are pale, and that very often indicates in such circumstances that those regions have been cut in the past, which could be decades ago or just within the last few years, and they are in some state of regrowth. By and large, these forests will never regrow as they were before. In fact, an ecologist could scarcely call what regrows a forest at all. And now looking off to the right, just outside of Miramichi, and all the land clear-cut except for the farms at the top of the screen that run along the main road. But an ecologist could hardly call what regrows a forest at all, because native biodiverse Acadian forests, rich with dozens of tree species, thousands of species of foliage, some of which would only grow in the deep forest and are thus now very rare and in danger of extirpation in this province. All those things are gone when the native forest is cut away. For the pulp cartel in no way replants forests that they cut. Typically what is done in New Brunswick is the forest is clear cut, the original trees removed for whatever purpose they're going to be used, and conifers are replanted, which are the trees that the pulp cartel is after. The conifers pretty much take over the entire region, and as the native foliage, including deciduous trees, try to recolonize the area, the forestry cartel, at the taxpayer's expense, has those regions of forest sprayed with various herbicides, especially glyphosate, or something similar, which destroys the deciduous saplings, as well as the foliage growing up beneath them, and very likely damages the essential microscopic flora that live beneath the ground, which are essential for fixing nitrogen, helpful in carbon sequestration, and useful in processing the nutrients in soil into a form that plants as well as trees can use. We're just now passing over Miramichi, right over its airport, but we won't be stopping here. So the forests of New Brunswick are triply assaulted, hammered in 3 different significant ways by the forestry cartel, as if the forestry cartel is at war with the native forests. The original forest is clear cut away, and perhaps those trees, many of them hardwoods, to be used to make musical instruments, furniture, or simply firewood, who knows. But when those forests are cut, their biodiversity goes with them, as well as their capability of providing shelter and good cover, and much of their food-producing capability. But then the forestry cartel goes back and hits them again, this time by replanting coniferous trees. Now, coniferous trees are part of an Acadian forest, but the forestry cartel does not want the original deciduous trees that were there. For them, those trees are by and large weed trees. So they plant pretty much exclusively coniferous trees, which is what it means to borealize the Acadian forest, the native biodiverse collection of deciduous and coniferous trees, some from more temperate regions of eastern North America, and some from more northern regions, are cut away and replaced almost exclusively with the conifers of more northern regions. Hence the Acadian forest is forced to resemble a boreal ecosystem. But that's not enough. Then comes assault number 3. The Acadian ecosystem does try to reassert itself. There are seeds from the previous trees still in the ground, left over from the trees that once stood upon that land, and the stumps themselves may try to regrow, especially if the forests were cut when it was cold, and seeds may blow over from neighboring areas or be carried over by birds. But the forestry cartel cannot have those weed trees regrow. So where the native forest once stood is hammered with herbicide, killing nature's attempt to reestablish its native forest. The entire operation is conducted like an assault on 3 fronts, and its goal is the complete suppression of the natural native forest ecosystem, and the purpose of the goal is only to benefit the financial interest of the gigantic forestry cartel which currently predominates New Brunswick. Out the starboard window you can see more clear cuts going on and on to the horizon. This is pretty much what you see everywhere in New Brunswick these days, except for within national parks and wilderness preserves. But what is important to understand is that this purpose of intentional borealization of the Acadian forest means that even where you don't see clear cuts, from the ground in many places that appear green, the original forest has been removed, and the almost pure stand of conifers that is now there is an artificial forest ecosystem, a tree plantation, a farm of trees that has been set there by the pulp cartel at some point to grow until they're ready to harvest it again, which means that long after, decades after, the clear cutting is done in a region, the ecosystem is scarred and remains that way. it remains defective. It remains borealized. The Acadian forest that was once there gone, and in its place, an imitation boreal forest that should not be there. Looks like we're passing over a power line clearing, and we're getting into the region of the next satellite map, where we'll be flying through the area around Bathurst. The landscape is going to change not far ahead, but what you can see both in the satellite map and from the air presented through the satellite imagery as portrayed within the Microsoft Flight Simulator is a landscape scarred by a vast and broad expanse of clear cuts. And the simple truth is that except in those areas, such as national parks or where the land is simply inaccessible, perhaps it's wetlands, perhaps among highlands, the clear cutting has gone on from decades in the past right into the present, so that it has reached a point that it is difficult to find an area of forest that is unscarred, undamaged, and ecologically intact. Looking off the port side wing toward the west, we see the scarring of the clear cuts in the landscape as far as the eye can see, so that the forest has been reduced to a simple patchwork of clear cuts and damaged forest, and that is the way of the land in New Brunswick. Unfortunately, in those areas where regrowth has gone on longer, the utility of this land to support the local ecology, the local wildlife and flora and fungi, is fairly limited. For those species that require stable, old-growth forests, they aren't going to get it. Not long after any of these woodlands begin to look mature, they'll be cut again. But you might recall from our last video, the New Brunswick Forestry Apocalypse Brockway to Moncton, that we talked about how limited the environmental usefulness is of small patches of forest. Animals will tend to seek the shelter deep within the forest, and the smaller a forest patch is, the more of its space is defined as outer edge or transitional zone forest, and the less useful it will be for those animals that are reliant on the deep shelter and ecosystems of a true, large, living and breathing, mature to old-growth forest. And what's more, the omnipresence of forestry access roads just everywhere means that all those areas are accessible to hunters, but in particular, poachers. And those species, which require solitude and sequestration in order to recover, simply will not be able to get it. Even if what accesses those areas are only people on things like ATVs or even hikers, because those small patches of forest everywhere are broken up and accessible by way of the endless forestry access roads, the flora and fauna of those ecosystems will be under constant pressure. We're now beginning to move north of the area of Bathurst into the region known as Restigouche County, and I notice immediately that the photogrammetry technology of the Microsoft Flight Simulator seems to be struggling here, as it's relating some unusual features in the landscape. Roads appear to come and go out of nowhere. There are vast areas of trees and vast breaks or meadows. Now, in woodlands, breaks and meadows can be perfectly natural, caused by forest fires or simply the forest encountering rocky ground where the trees do not grow so well. Or sometimes trees come up against low, wet ground, just too wet for them to take root and flourish, except for the few species that are more adapted to such conditions. In the north, that would be things like black spruce. Though even then they may struggle. Black spruce often look like they're barely hanging on to life to begin with, but when I've encountered them growing in the muskegs of the north, they look like they're having an especially difficult time. Down there we see what appears to be a logging access road going to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it may well be a camp, though from 5,000 feet that building looked awfully big. Now often what it means when the photogrammetry begins to struggle in a place like this is that we've hit a spot that either has not been well imaged by satellites, or the features in the landscape confuse the photogrammetry. So what we're going to do here is simplify the picture by getting photogrammetry out of the way. Here's the region portrayed by satellite imagery at nearly 140 kilometers altitude. The region appears to be heavily pockmarked by large clearings representing clear cuts. The landscape here has become more rolling though, and I suspect it's the rolling nature of the landscape which is confusing the photogrammetry. It's designed to interpret the land as cities, towns, and suburbs. It doesn't know what it should throw in there when it hits a rolling landscape, which from the air can roughly resemble the shape of a building, yet it's obviously too large to be. But the actual satellite photography shows that this region, just like everywhere else in New Brunswick, has been devastated. That's the only accurate word for it. Simply devastated by the activities of the forestry cartel. If we zoom in and take a closer look at the landscape, the real picture very quickly begins to emerge. This is about 400 square kilometers, portrayed from an altitude of 16 kilometers, which would be well into the stratosphere. And looking straight down at it, we can see a landscape that is heavily striated by heavy machinery used to make clearcuts recently. Many bare brown patches represent somewhat older clearcuts, and there are darker patches which may represent forest in partial regrowth or full regrowth. But everywhere you look, except for possibly to the far right of this map, one can see forestry access roads everywhere. If the forestry cartel has not already been there, they plan to go there soon. And here, lying just a little further west from an altitude of about 20 kilometers, a little further into the stratosphere, we find more of the same, except the devastation of the local forest is more complete. Notice the thin light tracings of forestry access roads all over this image. Even if there were forests standing here, and this represents about 500 kilometers square, none of this countryside would any longer represent any real respite or deep wood shelter for those species that require undisturbed, mature, and old-growth forests. Both satellite imagery and photogrammetry reveal a landscape so devastated, so utterly deforested, that it only reflects breaks of woods interspersed with massive barren areas. We are now in the last leg of our journey, between 20 and 30 miles out from Charlo, which is at the upper left of the satellite image. We'll be landing there, but as you will see, the clearcuts, the broken forests, and the forestry access roads continue virtually to the edge of Charlo. However, it looks like we're heading into an area of highlands, a region that resembles the agneau roulé, the scalloped landscape I'm familiar with from more northern terrains. And in such areas, there are waterways everywhere and steep slopes to deal with, and that kind of terrain tends to give some protection to the forest environment, namely in that it's much harder to conduct clearcutting activities in it. However, as you will see, the flat tops of this landscape are open game, and in many places the forests up there have been removed. You can see right out there, just outside the port side window, the forested tops of these highlands have been scalped, engraved with forestry access roads, and in the middle to the foreground you can see the striations that indicate recent clearcuts and tree plantation activities. This will be the way of the landscape for many miles to come, till we finally land at Charlo. West and east, we find a devastated forest. New clearcuts, scars of clearcuts, forestry access roads leading to more clearcuts. In fact, I'm not sure just what or how much of that landscape might actually represent healthy, ecologically sound Acadian forest. East, west, or north, in every direction we turn and look, the devastation is vast and widespread. So much so that I think the somewhat dramatic sounding title of this series, The New Brunswick Forestry Apocalypse, can only be said to be exactly accurate. It is indeed much, much harder to find healthy woodlands than it is to find a landscape scarred, environmentally damaged, and overburdened by clearcuts. Which brings me to an important challenge I'm going to make in this video. It was, after all, Mike Legere, Executive Director of Forestry New Brunswick, who suggested that documentarians must show carefully curated imagery in order to misrepresent New Brunswick forests as environmentally overburdened, damaged, and profoundly at risk. Well, this is now the third video in which I've flown over large regions of New Brunswick, showing the interior and much of the southern and eastern perimeters of the province. And at no time have the cameras been turned off, at no time has the landscape been unrevealed, and at no time has it been difficult in any way whatsoever to find a landscape riddled and devastated by industrial forestry activities. So I'm going to pose Mike Legere a challenge. Michael, I challenge you to find me one single square mile anywhere in New Brunswick of forest that has been clear-cut anytime in the last 2 generations or 40 years, that has actually been replanted with the full and biodiverse range of Acadian forest tree and shrub species in order to properly regrow the forest that once was there. You and I both know that 1 square mile is not an awful lot, 640 acres, which means out of the tens of thousands of clearcuts conducted by industrial forestry throughout New Brunswick over the last 2 generations, you only need to find 1 single parcel that was replanted with the goal of restoring Acadian forests. This doesn't mean that parcel was simply left alone for trees to grow there naturally, but was actually replanted with the specific goal of reestablishing that forest. And if you can produce this mythical beast, confirm that with GPS coordinates, so that I and other persons, ecologists, biologists, mycologists, and any other experts can go and look over that landscape and confirm that it is indeed a healthy and intentionally restored Acadian forest. And so that any person, regardless of their areas of education or expertise, can go and see it for themselves, can see the marvel of a natural autochthonous woodland that the forestry cartel has actually gone out of its way to restore. All I'm asking for is 1 square mile, Michael. Let's see it. And if you can't produce it, then perhaps the correct conclusion is that you, as the executive director of Forestry New Brunswick, are carefully curating your words to misrepresent the true status and true wide-ranging effect of industrial forestry activities to the people of New Brunswick, in hopes perhaps of pacifying them just a little bit longer. 1 square mile isn't going to count for much, but at least it might demonstrate that somewhere, at some point, somebody in your industry did more than pay lip service to what a forest is, and what a healthy ecosystem is, and actually did something to show they cared. They say actions speak louder than words, and I would like to hear some loud speech. And I think it's a very safe bet that tens of thousands of New Brunswickers, Nova Scotians, in fact the people of the maritime provinces in general, agree with me. Put your money where your mouth is. Show a landscape that you can prove was subject to industrial level cutting, and the plan to truly rehabilitate the forest that once stood there, and the successful restoration of that Acadian forest. Okay, we're just on the outskirts of Charlo now, and as I turn this very fast and powerful aircraft to line it up with the local runway, we can see here, right here, even at the very edge of Charlo, the clearcuts continue. Fresh clearcuts, moderately aged clearcuts, old clearcuts. Out of sight and out of mind. Or maybe not so much out of mind anymore, for a world of publicly accessible satellite imagery is changing things, and it's just not going to be so possible anymore to keep environmental devastation in the shadows. As we descend the last couple thousand feet and begin the final lineup on the runway at Charlo, I want to turn your attention to this article, which appeared in The Guardian on March 10th by Alistair G., entitled, "Is This the End of Forests as We've Known Them?" This very insightful article addresses a phenomenon being seen lately by ecologists who work in and around forests. They are seeing, especially in the American Southwest, that forests that have died through being clear-cut or destroyed in natural events such as forest fires are having much greater difficulty coming back. And this is largely attributed to the landscape being drier as a result of climate change, though it notes that even places long since considered much less susceptible to climate change, because they were innately cooler and wetter, such as Europe, and by extension the Maritimes, are also beginning to see this effect. But this article also brings to mind a very important reality for us to consider. It takes about 80 years for a clear-cut forest to reach maturity, 3 human generations, and it takes centuries for a forest to become a true old-growth environment, well over a dozen generations. Every time a truly old and mature forest is cut away, that is something we steal from our children, something they will never see nor experience, and such things would have no chance to return, provided they even could, for longer than our nation has even existed. To destroy our forests for a profit now is to rob our progeny of their birthright, a green and living world. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of natural science and environmental issues. If you like our program, please take a moment to subscribe and like.
Autumn leaves are turning brown, branches bare.